Hello again. In this video I'm going to show you how I set ride height on my oval car and how I make shock spacers out of tubing. Now first, the tubing that you get needs to be some kind of a hard plastic material. You don't want to use any kind of a rubber tubing. The silicone oil can make the rubber swell, and you don't want something that's going to be soft and compressible, because the last thing you want is as you add tension to the springs, you don't want the shock spacer to be squeezed shorter, throwing off your settings. So what you're going to want to look for is some kind of a hard plastic tubing. You want the inside diameter to be at least 3 millimeters so it can slide over the shock shaft, because this goes inside the shock absorber. So basically what I do is I determine what the height of the chassis needs to be off of the surface. And in my case, what I'm using here is literally an old iPhone 4 to use as a spacer. Now what I've done is I have taken the shocks off of the vehicle, removed the springs and the bottom shock cups over here. Got the springs removed and the bottom shock cups removed, and I've reinstalled the shocks on the chassis. So I'm going to set this on my spacer where I want it to be, and I'm going to use a fine tip Sharpie marker, and I'm going to put a line on the shock shafts. That way, I hope you can see this when I lift. I don't know if you can see that, but anyways, there's a small line on the shock shaft, and the distance between the shock shaft and the bottom cap on the shock is the length that the spacer needs to be to make the shock the length that I want when it's done. So let me get these shocks off and I will show you how they go in. Alright, I have the shocks off the car. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. If I can think, you can just see that line on the shock shaft. That's where I marked it with the marker, and the distance between that line and the cap is how long I'm going to make these new spacers. I already have some spacers in, but I'm going to add length to them. So I just measure from the end of the shock cap to that line, and this particular ruler is in tenths of an inch. You make 2/10 of an inch spacers for the front. Let me check this one. 2/10 of an inch, and in the rear, a little more than 3/10 on that one. Right at 3/10. Okay, so I'm going to do 2/10 of an inch on the front, 3/10 of an inch on the rear. And making the spacers is pretty simple. It's going to use little flush cutters to cut the tubing. Get my marker. And a fine tip marker is the thing to use, so you get a small line to measure and cut. 2/10. You try to cut this as square as possible. There's one spacer. Here's the other one. Second spacer. Now I need to do 3/10 for the rear. And the same process works if you're starting with no spacers at all in the shocks. You do the same type of thing. The distance between the mark and the bottom of the cap is how long you need to make the spacers. And I know there are some companies that make plastic discs you can stack up. But this plastic tubing is cheap. You find it in a hardware store or any place that sells different types of tubing. And a piece that's started as a foot long, you can make a whole bunch of spacers. So I'll let me get one of the shocks taken apart and we'll go over how you install them. Okay, I've got the shocks out of the vehicle. Basic disassembly done. I've just got them standing here in a shock stand. I made that on my 3D printer. Here is the piston and the shaft assembly. Now, I've already got this is a piece of tubing that I put in previously. It looks blue because it has been dyed by the color of the shock oil. I'm just going to take this and the little spacer that I just made, slip it over the shock shaft. Push it in, and that basically just shortens up the shaft, makes the overall shock shorter, allow me to pull the chassis to the ground. Now I just fill with the oil that I want to use, put the eyelet back on the bottom of the shock shaft, reassemble the shocks, put them back on the vehicle, and I'll be set and ready. The only thing I will warn you in advance is by adding the spacer, it makes it a lot more difficult to bleed the air out of the shock. So if you have come up with something to put your shocks in, that way as you're working on trying to cycle the oil out, you can leave them sit, let the oil naturally bleed out of the air, bleed out of the oil. And don't fight it, don't rush it. It's just going to take more time because you can't pull the piston all the way to the bottom. You're going to have that area that you can't do anything about. You got to wait for the air to come out of it. Now, keeping you updated with this project, I'm going to be putting 100 weight oil in the rear and 90 weight oil in the front to really kind of numb out the feeling up for this car, because this is the one I'm trying to push for maximum speed around the track. If you have any questions about the shock stand, or the car stand for that matter, I made that on the 3D printer. If you have any questions about any of this stuff, please just feel free to ask and I will answer it as best I can. Don't forget, give me a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to, and I'll keep producing the videos. Get out to the racetrack, have some fun, and don't spend a bunch of money doing it. Just enjoy yourself.